This one? Okay. So we'll have a quick kind of non-technical talk that will focus on legal questions surrounding the blockchain and the emerging paradigms. I'm Florian Glatz, I'm a lawyer, and this is Nina Siedler, she's also a lawyer. We're an interesting pair because Nina, she's working in a big law firm, like super international, superstar firm that is nonetheless interested in this kind of niche that blockchain represents today, but could be very different tomorrow. And I'm a kind of young independent lawyer, just being self-employed, and we're both kind of come together in this blockchain world. And today we want to give a kind of talk together, both giving our different perspectives on the blockchain from a legal perspective. And it will be very kind of similar, but also different, just because we work in a kind of different professional setting. Okay, so I will start off with kind of my definition of blockchain, which is funny to give it to a room full of technical people, but I think it's nonetheless important because at some point the blockchain will be defined by lawyers, and that will have a huge consequence for where can you apply a blockchain in some kind of process and what do you need to respect. My kind of most general definition that I could come up with that embraces this, just like Jutta mentioned, this potential future where we have many blockchains, some of which are permissioned and private, some of which are public and based on proof of work and proof of stake and everything. So my definition is that it is an immutable append-only database that records some information about the world. And I think this is the most important part. It's being shared in a network of stakeholders who agree that whatever is written in this database is true to them, or in a legal definition of the word, legally binding for them. Okay. Exactly. So I think in this kind of simple picture, you can kind of file any blockchain combination of private public that we have. Bitcoin and Ethereum, they're obviously public and permissionless. And we have the permission and private field where we have Eris, or now they're called monarchs. And we have permissioned and public even, which is like the IPFS, not IPFS, IPDB idea, which is based on BigChain. And basically it's a public infrastructure, but it's still run by kind of a trusted set of nodes. The basic difference between permissionless and permissioned, I think, is that in the permissionless scheme you have this Nakamoto consensus, how we came to call it, the proof of work, or now it will evolve maybe to something else like proof of stake. And interestingly, in the permission scheme, we have something that looks very familiar to lawyers. In the beginning, we have known identities, so it could be a group of banks, for example, that wants to run a blockchain together, so they are all known identities. They will close classical contracts among themselves where they define the rules of how they want to run this blockchain in a classical legal contract. And then they will go ahead and codify some parts of that legal agreement into a protocol, which will be their blockchain protocol, and which they will then run together in a joint kind of infrastructure. And this will be a blockchain that may be completely private, or there may be partial access to outside parties like, I don't know, auditors and taxing authorities and whoever wants to onboard on such a kind of blockchain. Yeah, to sum it up, for me, that's how I kind of, so Wednesday I had the honor of talking to kind of higher politicians here in Germany that want to understand what blockchain is because they hear it everywhere, and they heard that it's also relevant to them. And the way I sum up the essence of what a blockchain is that a blockchains turn data into facts. okay, supported through computation based on a consensus mechanism. And of course, as we all learned, facts are relative to their consensus group. So we can have a consensus group like the Ethereum network before the split, where everybody was kind of on the same page, and then an event happened where we had this big disagreement within one consensus group, and the consensus group decided to split up into two, and from now on they live kind of a separate life where they interpret certain facts differently. They are the same, it's the same data, but they have a different opinion about it. And now that's kind of my intro into how I look at the blockchain as a lawyer, and now I'm giving over to Nina.
Okay, thanks, Florian. Yeah, actually, when I heard first about blockchain, that was with an article about the R3 consortium, because I'm a finance lawyer, so a lot of my clients joined that consortium, and I got curious and asked a friend who I was aware is a software developer to explain me what blockchain is about. And then we spent an evening discussing, and I slowly began to understand what the aim here is, and I raised a lot of questions and concerns and said, wait a minute, how can that work? From a legal perspective, this is a little bit difficult. And then at one point he said to me, well, Nina, your law is simply not attractive. And he basically meant, I don't care. And I said, okay, that's somewhat new to me. For somebody who wants to do a true business, will be a little bit difficult if you do that completely outside the law. And since then, I started to look deeper into it and figured out that I would like to promote like the basics of law to the blockchain scene, because it will be possible to some extent to make this all legally working and happening. But I think you simply have to consider the legal environment which is out there. So that's the first one, the first big problem, the multi-jurisdictional challenge. Your technology is global, law is not, and it will not be that soon. It is fragmented into hundreds of jurisdictions. The UN alone has about 193 members, all having its own jurisdictions, and then you have tons of bi- and multilateral agreements between the states, like the EU has a huge output of legal frameworks. So there is no such thing, unfortunately, like one unified law. And wherever you want to do business, you have to apply with the law applicable at that place. It won't be possible to be compliant from the beginning globally. It's simply practically impossible. So the best currently is to start wherever you are, start with your own jurisdiction, and then broaden your offer from there. Unfortunately, if you want to be sure you are compliant, you need to opt out in the beginning of the jurisdictions you do not understand yet. But maybe it's some relief to hear that you're not alone with that problem. It's very well known everywhere in the business world. Everybody who wants to offer service or products across the border has to face this issue. So it's nothing new. But unfortunately, it's simply the way it currently is. So one obvious use case, and you didn't say anything about use cases yet, but I think you're doing that later, right? One obvious use case for blockchains are the public registers, like land register and commercial register. And there are a lot of startups thinking currently about how to better implement that, make it quicker, make it safer, make it easier accessible for the people, and also cheaper, because usually those registers come with quite heavy fees. The issue with that is that you can build a great technique around this, solving all the issues, but the key thing about the public registers is that there is public trust vested by law in the entries of those current registers, and that cannot be transferred without the law being changed. So, you can create great things, but you will not get this public trust without the law being amended. And I think that's a main issue with any business case surrounding public registers currently. I mean, at least Sweden is experimenting with the land register on blockchain, and I think others will follow. But for the time being, be careful when you start thinking about building something in that area. Smart contracts. We heard a lot about it already before, self-executing software. From a legal perspective, there's always this question, is code law or not? It can be, actually. Everywhere where a contract does not require a specific form, you can actually agree that the code is law. That's not an issue. The only issue is that there is no contract which is only black and white, which contains only black and white provisions. There will always be topics which are in the gray area, which cannot be coded, therefore. So you have to think about it in a way that the typical legal contract can only be partly coded. It will not be possible to code it completely. So what we prefer to do is to use the dual system whereby you have still your prose contract and then extract whatever you can code into the code. So I think that's a practical approach to that. And it's just one further click usually, because you simply click like you always do when you purchase something in the internet, accept general terms and conditions, and then it's done, right? And
I have something to add there.
yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, so lawyers love smart contracts because it has contract in the name. It has not much else to do with it, if we're really honest about it, but it's awesome to talk about. Yeah, so one interesting observation that isn't even my own, but I stumbled upon it, and I think it's beautiful, is you could say that legal contracts and smart contracts have two fundamental different design principles behind them. Legal contracts, if you've ever read one, and I'm sure most of you did, most of the words in such a contract are not spent on describing what is actually supposed to happen if everything goes well in that contract. Most of the text is about what if something goes wrong, what should then happen. And a contract is then a well-drafted contract if it anticipates basically everything that is likely or somehow likely to happen within the relevant time frame where this agreement is being executed. And in a very real sense, a smart contract does the opposite. A smart contract just defines the happy path of the anticipated relationship. What does it mean? It has an initial state, and in the code you define valid state transitions in the code, and everything that does not fit the criteria of such a valid state transition will automatically be rejected by the machine, by the protocol. It's going to be an invalid transaction, so you don't need to anticipate kind of special cases of invalid transaction. You just specify rather what is valid. So that leads to a picture where smart contracts seem to be very much more kind of practical and kind of slim and more and like superior. Though just like Nina said, I think the truth is somewhere in between, where you kind of want the best of both worlds, kind of a way to combine it. So how would you go ahead and, yeah, so a list of reasons why you would want to combine smart and legal agreements in the end is that there are limitations of smart contracts, and they are rather severe. One of them is there is no, like a smart contract, if you think about it as an autonomous agent living on a blockchain, doesn't have the ability to connect to the wider internet. It always has to be the internet that connects to the smart contract. So the smart contract cannot pull information. The information needs to be pushed So that creates a trust issue always. If you want information from the world on a blockchain, it's a trust problem. There are ways to mitigate the trust, but you'll never be able to solve it completely. So the smart contract as kind of this encapsulated autonomous agent really is not that powerful if you think about the kind of information it has access to in a first kind of. And a second reason I think is that so smart contracts have to be deterministic because they have to evaluate to the same result for the same input on any computer on the planet. That's why we have the EVM, and the code has to be deterministic. The problem of that is that as a lawyer, any lawyer will tell you that it's just impossible to anticipate everything in the beginning of a relationship that is going to happen in the course of that relationship. And the same is true for contracts and even smart contracts. So you actually want mechanisms in a smart contract that allow you to capture exceptions in a sense, but not code exceptions, but like real life exceptions. Okay. And another big problem, I think, is that the semantic capabilities of software in general are very limited compared to natural language or prose. And I express it in the way that I say that smart contracts are really limited to the transactional logic of a relationship. But in law, we put much more context into every contract than just the pure transaction logic. Why? Because at some point in the future, a third person might look at that document and might not be able to make a good decision that is fair for both parties if that third person lacks the necessary context to understand why that agreement has been closed in the first place. So a good contract contains a lot of prose that is not about transactional logic, but just about giving context for the future for third parties like judges that wield special powers and have the ability to kind of rearrange the legal relationship outside of what has been immediately specified in the contract. So you want to give that person a lot of information. So, yeah. In law, actually, it was realized in the 70s that this idea of like super strict and formal, like this kind of formalism in contracts has been realized to not really work in the real world. And this movement, this kind of movement in academia is where it started, was called or is called legal realism. The main ideas of legal realism are that contracts are always incomplete. They never capture all aspects of a relationship. They don't faithfully reflect the complexity of the real world. Paper can be ignored. Like parties can close a contract and never be faithful to it. If they both agree that they don't care, then nobody will care ever. And contracts can be reinterpreted by judges or by the parties themselves and so on. And I argue, and I think Nina agrees, that we kind of need a blockchain realism. That we need kind of the same insights that legal realists had like 50 years ago, that we need them also in the blockchain space. And we need to realize that smart contracts are incomplete, that they need a legal layer, as we saw, for example, in the Ethereum hard fork, where suddenly when this hack happened, people were talking about the intent behind the code of the DAO contract, okay? That is legal talk. And two big kind of strategies for that are smart legal contracts, which is this combination of smart and legal contracts, and like dispute resolution mechanisms for smart contracts. Yeah, so I just want to show two ways to do smart legal contracts. One is kind of well known, I think it's being implemented in a lot of instances. Basically, you have a smart contract and a legal contract, and they're kind of linked. So how do you do the link technologically? You create a digital hash of the legal document, and you put it into the smart contract, and then everyone forever will know that some document with hash blah blah is linked to the smart contract, and then you should host the digital file from which you created this fingerprint, you should host it on IPFS, I guess, so it's never being changed or removed. And now the more evolved idea of this, and this is like sci-fi, but it's being kind of created now, is this idea of a legal programming language where Solidity as a smart contract programming language would just kind of be a subset of, okay? So a legal programming language is much broader. It's like a super formalized legal language or legal natural language, just so formalized that you can parse it and make it kind of not really executable, but basically to derive in a deterministic fashion other documents from it, like a natural language version. So you have a programmed contract and you derive in a deterministic manner a natural language version from it. That's not possible today, but it's being worked on. And you can also create a Solidity executable smart contract version of this. So this could maybe be the future, like legal programming, but that's just speculation. This is how this could look like. So there is a group there called Legalese. They've some really good people working in their community. They're also like this holacratic community, so everybody can just join and talk to them. They're really cool, and this is their idea of, so it looks kind of like Lisp. They even call it L4. So I think it might be a reference to L3, which was, I think, one of the Ethereum smart contract programming languages before Solidity kind of took over. So it's L4. I forgot what it stands for. Dispute resolution, what do we have there? It's the other big pillar for this blockchain realism. It's this decentralized arbitration and mediation network. It was proposed as a proposal to the DAO actually, which then got hacked, and then obviously this project got never funded, but it was initialized or created by Andreas Antonopoulos, who's like this big figure in the Bitcoin and blockchain scene, and Pamela Morgan, who is an American lawyer. She's also a very interesting person in that space. And just in general, I mean, oracles are kind of the way to introduce dispute resolution on a blockchain. Yeah.
Before we go to regulatory. Yeah. Maybe some more few words on the differences between the legal side and the blockchain world. For example, when you sell some physical assets, right? You want to transfer the title of, I don't know, your watch on the blockchain. Problem with like jurisdiction is, for example, that the jurisdiction transfers whenever you cross the border, right? So that's something to consider for startups like this Diamonds title chain startup, I think out of the Netherlands, forgot how it's called. But that's a little bit difficult to manage, right? I don't say it's impossible, and we're actually working together in a legal working group from the Blockchain Hub, and just recently had the idea that we start a wiki about legal topics in the blockchain area, where we could just, you know, have very short descriptions of the issues and how it's solved, for example, here in Germany, and then invite colleagues from other jurisdictions to add, so that we will end up with like a library of legal issues and how this issue is treated in several jurisdictions, to make it a little bit easier to get the hands on issues like those. And then another issue is the potential conflict between the state monopoly of power. There's no fist law here in Germany, at least. And for example, when you rent out something, when you rent out your car or whatever, and time is over and you're only paid for a certain amount of time, then you are not allowed to simply grab it back, right? You need to get it back handed over to you. And that is something that also needs to be fed back then into the blockchain. You can, for example, Airbnb, the interesting idea of having your smartphone open the door when you paid the rent for like 2 weeks of your new home, and then after the 2 weeks you simply cannot access it anymore. That's a little bit of a legal issue, because then you're legally speaking locked out again. So those things need to be solved too. Yeah, obviously less problematic receivables, because there's no protection, there's no possession involved. Okay, let's see, what else do we have to... Smart contracts. Yeah, I think Florian mentioned already that ambiguities, gaps. And then, yeah, maybe another point. When I talked to my friend out of the blockchain scene, he was talking about all those computers contracting each other's and, you know, ordering automatically stuff. And I said, yeah, that's great. But the contract will nevertheless always be between the users. Computers are not accepted under the main jurisdictions as parties, right? So it's never the computer who is doing the contract. It's always the user having permitted that computer to do that or clicked the box.
Wouldn't that be an option, like the society came up with companies as a legal form of actually person, that happens to a computer in the future as well?
Yeah, there is a discussion actually in the EU about creating something that they call e-person. But that is actually meant to be designed for AI computers. But it needs to be attached with sufficient insurance, and there's always a liability of the one running the computer behind it, right? So in the end, there will always be either a natural person like we, or you know, some kind of corporation which will be held liable for what the computer does. And I think actually that's right? We shouldn't, you know, keep the computers doing whatever, you know, what was programmed, and nobody's responsible for that. Okay. Prior to me going to coins tokens, you're doing your regulatory?
Okay. Yeah. Just to add to that, I think it is a creative challenge for everyone to kind of accept that the law will play a role in blockchain, but then to be super creative, because you can, and just apply the law in a creative manner to kind of create the freedoms that you need. So if big corporations are allowed to pay 0 taxes because they do a double Dutch sandwich or whatever you call it, through routing money through Ireland, Amsterdam and everything, to pay no corporate taxes, I think we're allowed to create weird holding structures involving Hong Kong, Shanghai and Singapore and whatever is happening in the canton of Zug, to do the same with crypto, right? It's like the Wild West, so let's hack the law. That is like my statement about this. But of course, Nina's right. She's, so Nina, she's an expert in finance, so she does that stuff for corporations all the time. So I'm encouraging you to do it for crypto startups. Yes. Okay. Yeah, I don't have much left, really, just a few thoughts on regulatory issues, and it will actually also address this thing. Yeah, so the future of regulation, I see it in 3 rough categories. The kind of this defensive regulation is what we will see first, and what is really happening now. So on the EU level, there's a new, the fourth anti-money laundering directive being drafted now, or maybe it even left drafting stage already. It left drafting stage already, and it regulates crypto exchanges and hosted wallets. So if you host the private key of someone, you're regulated now. So stop doing it, decentralize your applications, host the keys on your clients, don't host the keys. Also, this whole ICO craziness that we're seeing now, this is going to come to an end. It's just not going to be tolerated by the states for much longer, I think. Crowdfunding is so the EU regulator is very much interested in regulating the gray capital market, as it's being called. That can be completely non-related to crypto. So there's a lot of gray capital market stuff with just fiat currencies. If you look at all the crowdfunding websites that we have seen in the past. But even just like there was this company, they were specialized in delivering pizzas in Germany, and it turned out that the way they structured their whole process of ordering the pizza and everything was actually a regulated financial business, like Lieferheld.de or something. Yeah, they were a payment service. They were regulated, and they just delivered pizza. Okay, so there's a lot of regulation coming, and this crypto crowdfunding or ICO stuff. This will be regulated, I think, in the next 3 years for sure. So it's not going to be forbidden. It's just going to be, there's going to be kind of rules on what's the minimum information you have to publish together with the token that you offer in order to reduce kind of the consumer fraud and the consumer risk. There might even be a maximum number of kind of value, like measured in euros probably, that you're allowed to collect, like maximum 100K per campaign or maximum 1 million per campaign, not the 150 million we've seen with the DAO. Just as Nina said, there is it's like in working group stage at the EU level, the liability of autonomous agents. They are more thinking in the lines of autonomous cars and robots and stuff, but obviously we all know smart contracts are just as autonomous or even more autonomous than cars. The second category for me is desirable regulation, like stuff that would really help us to make the blockchain a mainstream thing. I think the two most fundamental things, for me at least, are blockchain as a timestamping service. So if the blockchain is being recognized as kind of this reliable timestamping service, you could do amazing stuff in law and a lot of legal processes where today we have a lot of kind of complicated systems set up, a lot of intermediaries in place to kind of compensate for the fact that we do not have a trustable timestamping service available for basically all the digital processes that we use. And the same goes for digital signatures. So we all know that the blockchain, one of the primitives on which blockchains are built is the idea of public key cryptography. The problem with that is, although it's secure enough that we can have billions of dollars locked up in blockchains and no one capable of kind of just getting them and hacking them out, it's not secure enough for the law. The law requires you to have a valid digital signature, to create it with a chip card that has been created by some weird authority that no one knows, and to do it with a hardware device that is produced by one monopolistic hardware company. And that's the only way right now you can create a digital signature in Germany that has the same value as your written signature on a fax. Okay, so this is obviously not something that we can go into a digital future with. So we really need to change that. And just my last slide. So futuristic regulation for me is where the states actually start to offer public registries on the blockchain, to become an identity provider on the blockchain, to do the voting for the federal elections on the blockchain, and to do the currency issuance on the blockchain and all that stuff. So basically the states becoming a infrastructure provider, maybe running their own blockchain, or running just those kinds of services on the blockchain. This, I think, might be something we might see. I mean, some governments are looking into this, and I think it would be a very smart way if regulators chose to do that. Okay.
Maybe just some of you words about tokens. So big question, first of all, is what is a token? And I think there cannot be only one answer to it. Token can represent a lot of things. like a cryptocurrency, it can represent a share in an entity, or it can represent a voucher, which would be the less complicated thing to do from a legal perspective. Oh yeah, and I put here the current suggestion in the fourth anti-money laundering directive from the EU, which is currently out there and discussed with single nations involved, and I think it nearly passed already Germany without anybody jumping on this definition. And so virtual currencies are supposed to be in the future everything that is accepted by persons as a means of payment and can be transferred, stored, traded electronically. I mean, that's basically everything, right? And everybody who provides a gate towards such a cryptocurrency will need to become full compliant with the whole anti-money laundering rules out there, like a bank. Full identification of the ultimate beneficial owner at the ultimate end of, a chain of companies or whatever structure is behind it. I think not a lot of the current wallet providers will be able to deliver on that, and that will basically then be the end of their, legal business in here. Not sure if in any country somebody jumps on it and tries to narrow it a little bit down, because I think it will kill also a lot of very old systems. Not sure if you have heard about the regional currencies which are out there, which had usually been like paper printed or some kinds of self-produced coins used in certain regions to basically was like a side currency to the official one. Most famous one currently, I think, is the Zardex. Zardex is a cryptocurrency in Sardinia, Italy, which helped actually the agricultural people to find a way to sell their products in a very poor region, and it generated a whole small ecosystem on its own. So that was very successful. And in Germany, I think we have about 100 regional currencies, and part of those are not physical anymore, but only traded electronically, and they will be caught by such definition as well. So that's very unfortunate. I'm also highly interested in how they are going to handle all these voucher systems with that definition. Think about Miles and More, right? It's also used like a means of payment if you go and purchase with your miles, some goods on the Miles and More webpage. So I think they catch with this definition way too many like business systems. And it doesn't, unfortunately, there doesn't seem to be many people out there who discuss it. I don't know where it comes from, but it's there, it's in the draft.
The same discussion happened when New York introduced the bit license. So the same discussion happened when New York introduced the bit license. They licensed exchanges as the first kind of jurisdiction in the world. And Amazon, who has at least ideas of its own currency or voucher system, submitted opinions to the open cryptocurrency definition of the, So just saying the very same discussion happened in the US 1 or 2 years ago when the bit license happened.
Yeah. Okay, and then maybe just one last topic, and then we're stopping here. Tax. Always keep tax in mind. Whenever somebody comes to us and presents like a business model or business idea, the first thing we are checking is, how does the tax apply here? What does this mean? Do we need to restructure, refine it here and there a little bit to make it not too expensive? And obviously, if somebody is successful, tax authorities will be the first to come, right, and to ask. So it's VAT mainly, and income tax, where you surely have to take a look at whatever you start. All right, I think that's basically it from our side.
Perfect.
It was a premiere for us to do it together, actually. Questions? Yep.
Things complicated questions. I'll try to. So mainly you talk about code versus the law. That's a good idea. So,
Otherwise you won't be.
okay, so the question I wish to ask is, as a software developer who perhaps think I know a bit code, but know very little about the law. To me, the blockchain space, Bitcoin and so forth, has appeared to me as a kind of, in one way, as a way to rebellion, you know, against a system that people think is corrupt. So now my question to you is, like, again, as someone who doesn't know very little about the law, to me the law as a coder, as a developer, is just also a tool. I could be wrong, right? But in which it is used for different purposes, perhaps right, perhaps wrong. In the same way that as a coder can write good code, bad code, and has good or bad consequences, but in the end the code is seen also as a tool. Now, the law, sometimes it seems that in society, or we intermix the notion of right and wrong, ethics, with something that is legally correct. So, in other words, like, good things may be punished by the law, bad things may be permitted by the law. So now my question to you is, like, because I see all this effort of now the law trying to get a hold of something that was actually, perhaps in the first place, a way to free ourselves from the grip of something that was actually corrupt. So isn't it like, are we going perhaps in a circle, or how do you see that?
Actually, that really goes back to my initial discussions at the beginning of this year with my friend being a developer in this space. Actually, I understand that you try to get rid of the law and want to create your own rules, but unfortunately, the legal perspective is that there is no opt-out of the law, right? So everything that's done and that's happening is somehow built into the existing legal system. So what you can do, and I think that's a little bit of what we try to do, is figure out where this legal system that we all inherited, right, needs to be amended so that it is fit for the new world to come. The law is nothing static. It's always developing and always obviously lagging a little bit behind. It cannot be at the forefront of developments. So yeah, I mean, we're living in a democracy here, so stand up, find out what's not working well, what is actually hindering good things to develop, and then have it changed, right? And I think there will be certain support. There will be people who are not supporting it, but you simply need to discuss it. You need to convince the majority and get it done. I know, very theoretical, but also practically, I think that's the only way, and it will need some time.
Just to quickly clarify, because just a very brief clarification. So I appreciate both sides, the code and the law, and I see both, they have benefits, but at the same time they can have both bad consequences. So what I was more perhaps trying to point out is that shouldn't we, like when you code, sometimes you'll have meta things, you'll have something to abstract away from a conflict or a contradiction, and now it's a question, I have no clue, but could it be that as a society or as a civilization we would need something to abstract away from both technology challenging the law and then the law challenging the technology, but to abstract away from that conflict and have, I don't know, if you look at ancient traditions, a board of wise people, I don't know, but the thing is, like, to me, sometimes it's clearly hypocrite in society that we all know it's bad, but we tolerate it, but the law supports it and it's okay, So anyways, I just wanted to, I appreciate the legal frameworks and what we have in place. And in many respects, they do good. But I was trying to point out that, anyways, I was looking for your opinion on that, but, right? I'm not against the law, that's just I wanted to point out. But I'm also not against code, but I'm for both. What I'm trying to say is like, we need to be perhaps honest, to see what's the substratum, the underlying basis to that, so.
Yeah, just to add to what Nina said here, and I think it's a very important question that you're posing, and I think the underlying thing that you're looking for is the fact that if you have a group of people doing stuff together, they will always have conflicts, and you will always need mechanisms to resolve those conflicts. And the law is our oldest and most important tool to do that job. And it would be highly inefficient to get rid of it completely and to start from zero and to try to reinvent the wheel. It's not worth it. And although the law may seem kind of hostile from a person active in the blockchain scene or developing software in that scene, there were some really smart people in the last few thousand years that have contributed immensely to the legal tradition we all inherited. And there are a lot of gold nuggets in there that I would encourage everyone interested in those questions to look for and to try to re-implement them on this kind of new digital infrastructure that we're creating together. Okay.
And maybe I had a lot of discussions with Shamin from the Blockchain Hub about, future society and stuff like that. And, she is very fancy of the idea that we need to get rid of states and jurisdictions and that we completely need to reorganize our society because democracy is actually not capable for being used in societies as big as we today are. So I think there are a lot of interesting discussions out there, and I think everything is constantly moving, probably not as fast as all of us would wish. But things are happening, right? Look at Estonia with its e-residency, and then for example, the state of Delaware is currently reviewing all of their civil laws to make it blockchain friendly. They will certainly permit the issuance of shares via blockchain in the future. There are other US states, I think Vermont, who already accepted blockchain entries as evidence for facts happening. So the world and the law is changing all the time, right? And simply have to get up and raise your voice, and there will be somebody hearing you and supporting it.
Yeah, sure.